My name is Alyssa Cohen. I'm the Senior Vice President and Deputy Director of the museum, and very happy to welcome you all here. Just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you are new to the museum or first time here? Well, we hope you'll come again and be our frequent guests. We have an extraordinary program tonight. We have two of the senior members of the Spy Museum here. We should all feel very, very safe and comfortable. So I will get right into the introductions, and also I'm told that there are no bad questions, so just let it rip after the conversation. We will have time for a very robust Q&A. Peter Earnest is the founding executive director of the International Spy Museum and a 35-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. He ran a wide range of intelligence collection and covert action operations, including counterintelligence and double agent operations working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Military Intelligence. As museum director, he has played a leading role in its success as a Washington attraction, and I just found out that they have 700,000 guests a year at the Spy Museum. And they're moving to a bigger, better building. And he has frequently been interviewed by the major media in radio, TV, and the press on current intelligence issues. Dr. Vince Houghton is the historian and curator at the International Spy Museum. He specializes in military and intelligence history with specific expertise on late World War II and early Cold War era. Prior to joining us, Vince was a history professor at the University of Maryland and is also former military, having served in the U.S. Army. We hope you'll join us for more of the public programs. We have so much going on, including tomorrow night, a program about from Nuremberg to Eichmann. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Vince and Peter to the stage. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks for having us here tonight. Peter and I have done this for a while now. We think with similar minds on a lot of issues, so we hope that we can bring you some of our expertise, whether it's historical or subject matter pragmatic expertise on both the Eichmann case itself, some of the ins and outs, maybe a little bit behind the scenes of what was going on during the Eichmann exfiltration operation. Some more modern day thoughts about how maybe that exfiltration could happen today or not happen today. And as was mentioned, we are very happy to open it up to questions. And the questions don't necessarily have to stay within the parameters of Eichmann. This is kind of the anything you wanted to know about intelligence but we're afraid to ask opportunity here tonight. There are no stupid questions, and there are no questions that are off limits either. We have at the Spy Museum some very challenging audiences, so there's nothing you can ask that we won't be prepared for. A lot of former ex-spooks and stuff come to our programs, and they certainly want to try to grill us on everything they possibly can. So please, we'd love for you to try to trip us up on something.
Yeah, and I hope you kept that nuance in mind that Vince said we pretty much agree on almost everything. So if you want to ferret out those things where we don't agree, that's fair game. I would like to just take a moment to give a little of my background. So in terms of your shaping questions, you have a sense. I was 35 years in CIA. About 25 of that undercover and in clandestine operations. And so after that, I did a number of what they call seventh floor jobs. I was with our Inspector General. I was with our legislative liaison, which meant that I handled in my case, I handled, if anybody can, the Senate and the senators. Probably my hardest job. And then later I was director of media relations and spokesman for 3 directors. So in any of those areas in which you might be interested, I'm more than glad to take your questions. I know Vince will as well. So why don't we, Vince, chat a bit about the Eichmann case?
No, and I wanted to bring, I think we both have had equally difficult jobs. At one point, I taught high school kids, and you dealt with the United States Senate, which I'm not sure.
No, there is none. I mean,
Right, yeah.
think of the Senate, think middle school.
Right,
And
middle
you're
school,
okay.
that's
Yes,
true.
okay, yeah.
So
I envy you your job, yes.
So let me start by asking you a question, Peter, because you joined CIA in the late 1950s. I'm not,
Yes, actually 57.
I wasn't going to age you, but you can go ahead and do it yourself. And as we know, the Eichmann case happened a couple years later when you were still a relatively junior officer at CIA. I wonder how much the Eichmann case, for everything from the snatching by him of the Mossad to the trial itself, was conversation around CIA about how to do it the right way, about how amazing it was that they pulled it off the way they did. Anything that you can tell us about that?
Well, keep in mind I was a very junior officer then, and so the whole concept of operations was quite new to me. I had not yet gone through the farm by that time. In fact, I mean, I joined CIA for a number of reasons, one of which was I needed a job at the time. And then I got into CIA, and of course you get caught up with the nature of the work. But whenever something happens in the world, because CIA people by nature follow the events in the world, that's just what they do. Our focus is not so much domestic, but foreign. In fact, when things go wrong domestically, it's sort of a profound shock to the system because that hasn't been our focus. And riots and so forth and so on over those issues. And yet they affect the agency. They're all Americans, they're all American families, and so they're affected as well as everybody else. But in answer to Vince's question, often when events like that happen, there's a tremendous interest in the agency in the operational side of it. What happened? How did they get him out of, in this case, Argentina? What was the nature of the operation? And so a lot of that gets discussed, though I do remember in the Eichmann case, I was probably 12 years old, 11 or 12, when the concentration camps, when the Americans and Soviets went into the concentration camps. I remember being profoundly affected by the photographs coming out from that period, particularly in Life magazine. And so, to me, it was almost hard to put that together because Eichmann seemed like something out of the distant past. And I'd like to go back to that at some point, but it was like a piece of history come alive at that time for me.
Well, let me, I apologize for doing this in advance, but let me put you in the shoes of Adolf Eichmann for a second.
Thank you. Yeah. We don't agree on everything.
Yes. So he essentially was undercover in Argentina.
Yes.
He was hiding for almost 20 years under a false name, under false pretenses, was every day living his cover, which you also had to do for many years at CIA. And whether you know the story or not, one of the weak links of Eichmann's cover was his family. His son, Nick, ends up giving him away in many respects. And there's several things that lead to Eichmann's capture, but his son, Nick, who didn't know that his new girlfriend, the girl he was dating, had a Jewish background, happened to mention what his father's name was.
Yes.
And that was problematic for Eichmann. So can you talk a little bit about how much did your family know about what you did for a living? How much did you worry? Because you were in some places in Europe with your family at times, undercover. That wasn't, I'm a CIA officer, it's something else. How did you deal with that problem?
Yeah, well, keep in mind, CIA officers don't typically have warm-up jackets with CIA on the back of it because you then become an instant target. And that's so true in these recent years when we're dealing with terrorism as sort of the major adversary, the major thing that we're dealing with around the world, certainly one of the major things. Dealing with, or I don't want to say dealing with your family, that sounds, in the sense of having a family, the stress of having that other life, of being undercover, is one of those things that either brings a marriage closer together or can drive it farther apart, because it is stressful. You are out with strange people, and in some cases, In my case, my wife will know who I'm with or not know who I'm with. She will know it's about operations, but what does that mean? And you may be gone for periods of time, unexplained. And so it does put a stress on the family. There are those officers who virtually told their wives nothing. If you read Mike Morell's latest book, when they were closing in on Osama bin Laden, he shared nothing of that with his own wife. Some things are just highly compartmented right up until the end. In the case of the family, I had 4 daughters, 3 of them born abroad. And it becomes a question of, well, when do you tell them what daddy does? And our decision was to probably tell them when we got back home. I was overseas 9 years straight, with a couple of breaks for home leave. And so when they were around 12 individually, I told them daddy was with CIA. Well, my daughters had varying degrees of interest in things. One, what is CIA? Is that like a bakery, or do you deliver things, or, no knowledge. Some of my colleagues had a tougher time of it, because this was really the beginnings of the drug crisis in the United States, which has never ended. And so CIA and the Vietnam War were among the things that the people were protesting. And so for a father to tell daughter or son, I'm really with CIA, was not a very happy time. So some of us had different experiences. In my cases, my daughters were very accepting. That was not true of all families.
And when you told them, you obviously had to make sure that they weren't telling everybody else what you were doing also.
Yes,
I mean, that's, of course, in the Eichmann case, I'm sure his son was probably read the riot act at some point, like, hey, you probably shouldn't tell people what her real name is.
That was basically why we would wait until they were a little older and wait until we were back in the States. Because even though you're overseas and you're undercover, if you tell your son or daughter a secret like that, what's the first thing a son or daughter will do? They have a secret. Tell their best friend, but only their best friend. Okay, it doesn't go any farther. Well, their best friend may be the son or daughter of the Bulgarian ambassador or something like that, because there's an awful lot of exchanges between the international crowd overseas, the so-called diplomatic crowd. So the trick, basically, I think for most of us, was to wait until we were back in the States and really gauge when it might be an appropriate time to tell that son or daughter about what you were really doing. It was hard for CIA people to follow the take your daughter to work ethic. It was just hard. And I said to my boss, what am I supposed to do? Take her to an agent meeting?
Well, I mean, a lot of people are undercover. You had official cover or unofficial cover?
I was largely under official cover, though I also did some things under non-official cover.
So that might sound like French to some of you, or Greek, in the case of Peter. So when CIA officers, or this is true for other countries as well, go overseas, they have one or two things. They're either under official cover, which means that they're pretending that they're a diplomat. Like they may say, I am the second deputy agricultural attaché to the U.S. Embassy. Their card might say, the Minister of Shrubberies, or something like that. That means that if they're arrested for spying, they have diplomatic immunity. The best you can do is kick them out of the country, name them persona non grata, put them on the next plane, they go away. The problem with that is those people are easy to follow. People are easy to spot because they have to announce themselves as diplomats. So it's very difficult for people with official cover to meet with assets overseas. Because if you're in Russia and you're pretending to be the second deputy agricultural attaché, it's likely the FSB, which is the Russian security service, will pretty much know you're CIA. And so it's very difficult to sneak away in the middle of the night to meet your spy, your asset, if you have official cover. Unofficial cover, we call them NOCs in the United States, for non-official cover. The Russians call them illegals, other countries call them other things, are overseas as tourists or business people. or as grad students, or anything but clergy and journalists really are the two that are well, because everyone already thinks journalists are spies. So we're not in the business of getting them killed because they think that. And clergy, same basic idea. You don't want to mess with the sanctity of any kind of clergy person. But you're over there under some false pretense. The key is if you're arrested for spying, what don't you have? Diplomatic immunity, which means that if they've got you good evidence and they are a country that has harsh laws, you may never see the light of day again. Or they can execute you or other things. Now that rarely happens, because what tends to happen is if they arrest our guys, we have our eye on several people who are probably illegally in the United States. We'll arrest their guys, and then there'll be a spy trade.
Yeah, and also the other thing that happens all too often is we may know who we are. We may have a cover or some sort of status that we're in. We really are a diplomat, an embassy officer, but no one else knows that story unless they're told it. And so the propaganda of, for example, the Soviet Union and others is simply to smear any Americans abroad. And that's why Peace Corps people, for example, are labeled, oh, CIA. That's why you so often read in the captures of hostages and others by ISIS and the terrorists, you're CIA, you're CIA. They almost assume that any American overseas must be with CIA or linked with CIA or doing something with CIA. So it's an easy label to hang on people.
Well, and that's why if you apply to the CIA today, and that's what you do, CIA.gov, an application online, there's actually a question about have you been in the Peace Corps? Because that actually disqualifies you from joining CIA for several years, because they don't want the Peace Corps to be tainted with the intelligence brush.
Yeah, I think people who've been in the agency, like myself, are barred from life.
Right, the other way around, forget it.
I think the other way around, it's 5 years.
Right, so there's a time period that you have to have separation so that they don't overlap. One thing I wanted to ask, I forgot, I thought you were going to talk about this. How relationship-wise, how is it problematic that your job is essentially to go overseas and lie then lie some more, and then lie some more, and then pretend you're somebody else? And that seems maybe not your relationship, your colleagues' relationships. If my wife knew my profession was lying, it might be difficult to have an honest conversation, or at least a conversation that she thinks is an honest conversation.
Well, keep in mind that you start out as an officer, and we're a long way from Eichmann right now, but you start out somebody as going overseas in a capacity which you really are not. So in my case, for example, being able to talk the language and to pose as an officer in the embassy or the military aid group and so forth, that itself is a lie, so that anything that flows from there you could construe as a lie. The point here is that there's an absolute premium on truth-telling inside the agency, and as you know, the whole ethic of the agency is speaking truth to power. That's what it's all about, is telling our leaders, particularly the president and the policymakers, the truth. So it's interesting to hear you put it that way. And it's not the first time I've heard it put that way. But there are, in many cases, you are in situations, and you're simply playing the role of someone else. It is a role. I mean, think of it very much in the acting profession. And some people were very, very good at it, and we would often use them for particularly elaborate operations. Some people were less so, and so be it.
We talked about speaking truth to power, so let's talk about that in the Eichmann case. This was a covert action, right? The actual capture of Eichmann was a covert action. And in the United States, it's very specific about who authorizes a covert action, and that has to go to the President of the United States. He signs a presidential finding for a covert action. And is it similar from what we know? I mean, how much, as we know the Prime Minister had to sign off specifically on this, how similar was the process of getting the permission to go after Eichmann in Israel as it was normally for us
Well,
in the United States.
one of the key books that I read most recently is Neil Bascom's book on hunting Eichmann. And it was fascinating for me to read in there that one of their last steps before they got the go-ahead from Ben-Gurion as it was, but one of the last steps was they touched base with the person who would be regarded as in our organization as the general counsel. In other words, is this okay to do this? And basically, it probably was not, but go ahead and do it. In other words, there are certain things. I remember interviewing the legislative counsel of CIA at one point, Fred Hitz, and I was talking about a covert action, and he said, Peter, he said, some things just can't be lawyered. And I think that this was true certainly in the case of Eichmann. That was an operation that they were determined to carry out, and it was for an end that turned out to be absolutely extraordinary. But one thing, let me just add to what you've said. Everything that we do that's classified or secret or covert or clandestine, the term covert action is a term of art, and it refers to things where you're trying to influence events abroad. And so it takes on a special status, and it requires the president to sign off, and it's also reviewed by our Department of Justice, our Attorney General, and the leadership of both houses of Congress. So it's covert, but certain people are brought in on it. But the president is the main player and signs the go-ahead. One of the things that you were asking me about just before we came in was asset validation. I wonder if you would want to say a word on that, and then we can talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think this is interesting because one of the most important things that a case officer, and that's the kind of technical term for what Peter did. Let's actually take a step back. Peter worked for the CIA for 35 plus years. Peter was never a spy. We don't think, right? Yeah. Peter was never a spy. Now you might go, well, of course Peter was a spy. He worked for CIA for 35 years. Now, in our lexicon, a spy is not somebody that works for a professional intelligence agency. A spy is somebody that you go and recruit overseas to give you information about their country. So Peter was what we call a case officer, an operations officer. The people in Greece or Bulgaria or Russia that Peter may have recruited, who were Russian or Greek or Bulgarian, those are the spies. So there's no one at CIA who's a spy, we hope. Right? That would be problematic because that means they were working for another government. So when we talk about asset validation is a key. When a case officer, someone like Peter, is getting information from someone, in some cases, they might just be somebody who walks in off the street to an embassy abroad or walks up to Peter because they think that they're talking to somebody from an embassy or maybe that he might be CIA, and they've got great documents that show top secret information about the Chinese government. We actually have people at the Spy Museum walk in and say, I work for this government, I've got a briefcase full of stuff. And we're like, we're a museum, let me walk you a block to the FBI, and they can take care of you. But that happens overseas all the time, where there's a term called a walk-in, where someone from a foreign government walk into the American embassy and say, I have information, I want to spy for you guys, I want to give you stuff that I'm not supposed to give you. Now, there's two problems with this. One is they could be absolutely insane. I was going to use a different word. That was a little four-letter. They could be loco. They could be crazy. Or they could be what's called a dangle. I don't know if you've heard this term before. A dangle is somebody who is being sent by the local intelligence agency to pretend that they are going to give you information, either to feed you disinformation, so feed you nonsense that you think you're getting good stuff, but you're getting garbage being thrown at you, or to get close to you to find out things like what information don't you have that you want, or find out things like who is in your leadership who actually works for CIA. Because the minute Peter, who's pretending that he works for the military attaché, says, yeah, you can talk to me, I'm CIA, he's outed himself. And if the asset's a dangle, then now the foreign government knows that Peter is CIA and they can kick him out of the country. So one of the most important things that needs to be done, and that was also done in the Eichmann case, was what we call asset validation. Number one, that is taking information that's trickling in, because there wasn't one person that said, I know who he is. It was lots of different pieces of information coming from a lot of different places, and saying, is this real? Can we trust this? Is this someone that we trust? Is this information that we're willing to put massive amount of resources behind? Because you think of this operation, Peter, that once they sent everybody in, and we'll talk about that, because that's really interesting also, if this group from Mossad and Shin Bet, actually it wasn't just the Mossad, it was Shin Bet as well, if this group from Mossad and Shin Bet had been arrested or caught by the Argentinians, that would have been a nightmare for Israeli foreign policy. So you had to know when you walked in the door. So can you talk a little bit about how you figured out who was real, who was fake, and how much worry did you have about dangles?
Sure. Well, it's a constant worry, but let me take that and apply particularly the Eichmann case. One of the things that struck me very much in hunting for Eichmann is the number of assets simply being an agent or a sympathizer or whatever you want to call it, but they're on our side. But if you'll notice how in the hunt for the Nazis, the Mossad, as well as some of the other Nazi hunters, had contacts. They had contacts here and there who could do things, who could drive a car, who could go make an inquiry. They were trusted people who could do things. Now, one of the questions that constantly comes up is, if you remember back in 2010 when there were some 10 Soviet, I'm dating myself, Russians
you were right.
arrested in this country, and they didn't appear to have any particular jobs, access to classified information. It was rolled up. The FBI had been following them for 10 years. Well, what were they here for? What was the purpose? They were classic, from our perspective, sleeper agents. They were there to be available in case there was a sensitive asset to be handled by someone outside the embassy. They were there perhaps to do something of a sensitive nature. It gives you players out in the community who are unidentified and are just quietly sleeping until they're needed. Those people can be very valuable. And the Israelis had those all over the place. And that really played out in hunting for Eichmann. The people they were able to rely on different countries. We have a term today that's used in business, due diligence. How do you tell a company is on the up and up? How can you tell this outfit is on the up and up? Well, if you have friends in that country, you have people who can go check on an address, look at a phone book, look up someone's business credentials. Those are assets. And so I'll give you one example of an asset validation that went terribly wrong. Vince mentioned there are no spies in the CIA. Well, unfortunately, we have had some people like Rick Ames. If you remember him, he was the CIA spy who turned in so many of the Soviet agents that we were running, and they were arrested, tried, and executed. When he moved into his $500,000 house in Vienna, Virginia, and paid cash, there was a question of, well, how could he do this? Well, his mother-in-law had signed a chit saying, you know, here's a gift, as it were. And so the question was, well, could she do that? Is she wealthy? And so we sent a separate asset agent down to Colombia, which is where we were from, and I said, and we asked the question, is this a wealthy family? Could somebody just do this? And the agent came back with the answer, yes, this is a very wealthy family. They own a whole chain of ice cream parlors, and this would be well within her means. That assuaged us for a while. We didn't do anything further. The problem was, that's a form of asset validation. We're simply part of an investigation that the agent had not done a good job. Yes, it was a wealthy family, but Rosario, the woman that Rick was dating, was not from that branch of the family. In other words, you know, operations, investigations can go wrong. They're formed out of links. They're formed out of talking to people, and people lie. People can get their information wrong. You can be deceived by your own assumptions. So asset validation is nothing more really than trying to figure out if the person standing in front of you, so to speak, is who they say they are. And this is what Vince is getting at.
And I think one of the most important assets from this time period was a West German official, I believe it's Fritz Bower.
Yes, Bower,
who
yeah.
was a friend of Israel, not somebody who was directly an asset of the Mossad, and he finally decided to leak to the Israelis that Eichmann was living under an assumed name, and actually told me assumed name. Now, you might ask the question, how did he know? And this is one of the dirty secrets, well, not so secret anymore, but at the time was one of the dirty secrets of the Eichmann case, is that the West Germans, and some would argue the CIA, knew where Eichmann was and what name he was operating under for about 2 years before the Israelis found out, and kept it secret. Now, there's about 50 reasons why. Most of them don't sound very good right now, but at the height of the Cold War, they made a lot of sense to a lot of people. You may know the fact that the United States and West Germany rehabilitated, I'm using that word with quotes around it, a lot of ex-Nazis for our use in either building spaceships. Wernher von Braun is a good example, really the father of NASA, who also built our first ICBM program, but also the first West German intelligence organization was founded under the direction of a man named Reinhard Gehlen. And Reinhard Gehlen was as Nazi can be. He was the head of the Eastern Front Intelligence Agency under the Nazis, focused on the Soviet Union, the Soviet War. And when the war ended, all of a sudden the Soviets are our enemies, not our friends anymore. And who knows the Soviets better than the guy who's been studying them for 6 years? And so Gehlen very quickly has his past scrubbed clean. He was a German officer, but not a Nazi, which is the mantra that you hear over and over again. And he recruited an organization that became known as the Org, or the Gehlen Organization. Now it's called the BND. It's a German version of the CIA, but the BND started with about 15 guys who were former high-level Nazi intelligence officials. And the worry was that if Eichmann had been captured, that during the trial, that he'd start bringing up all these names of all these people he knew, right? Oh, I work with Reinhard Gehlen, I work with this guy, I work with that guy. I think the number, the person who would be the equivalent of the head of the National Security Council, so the National Security Advisor in the United States, the West German version of that was a former high-level Nazi who worked very closely with Eichmann. So the fear with the West Germans and the Americans, less so, but certainly with the West Germans, was that Eichmann's capture would lead to massive embarrassment, would lead to a huge propaganda coup for the Soviets. And the Soviets at this time, these Germans, were already saying that anybody in West Germany was a former Nazi, whether they were or weren't. So this would have been really problematic. Now, that's their excuse, and in 1958 and 1959, it made a whole lot more sense than it does today. There is some evidence that CIA knew a little bit about this, about the Eichmann. They certainly knew about Gehlen, but about Eichmann. But at the time, the CIA really wasn't focused as much on this area. They were paying attention to bombers and missiles in the Soviet Union and Cuba and everywhere else.
You know, it's one of the things I mentioned at the top of the program was that having seen the photographs in the concentration camps, and I read many books at the time of the horrible things that happened in the concentration camps and so forth. It amazed me to finally, Baskin brings this out in his book, to realize what Ben-Gurion had foreseen, that capture Eichmann, put him on trial, and tell the story. And he realized, his vision was clear, that by having the story told in that way, it shook the world. Out of that trial, there were books by people like Hannah Arendt. It started discussions, it spawned movies, it spawned endless numbers of television, film, and documentaries. But that trial alone placed the story of the Holocaust in a place where it could not be ignored, even though there are still deniers. It could not be ignored. But more than that, it facilitated the people who had been victims of the Holocaust to come forward and tell their story. That trial triggered that as much as any other single event.
And we want to throw this out to questions, but before we do that, I want to emphasize one thing, and I think that some of the conceit that we've had up here is that we can kind of compare CIA and Mossad, and I want to emphasize that there is no comparison. I don't mean that from a CIA is better thing. I mean that CIA gets billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars to do their job. Mossad punches way above their weight class. But the bigger issue here is if Peter had been captured when he was undercover as a non-official, right? If he's he may have been interrogated. I don't mean harshly. He probably would have been questioned for a long time. He may have been put in a dank prison cell. But there's a gentleman's rule in espionage, and this goes back hundreds of years, that killing the other side's spies was bad business. Because if overseas, if the Russians bump off a bunch of people that they suspect being part of CIA, we're going to reciprocate here. Maybe we won't kill them, but we're going to make their lives miserable. And that seems to be the way most industrialized nations do it. Now, North Korea, Iran, places like that, but even Iran, right? They seem to want to be part of the world of nations. They're not running around killing off people that they assume to be spies. That's not the environment the Mossad works in. They're not working within this gentleman's agreement. If they're caught trying to infiltrate Hamas or Hezbollah or now Al-Qaeda or one of these organizations, they're not going to get traded back for someone. If they're caught trying to do the vast majority of things that they're doing, or if they run into a situation where there is a dangle or a double agent, it's less likely you're going to get an Aldrich Ames situation, more likely you're going to get a Coast situation. And if you don't know what happened in Coast, Afghanistan, almost 10 years ago, we thought we had recruited a Jordanian doctor who had direct access to Osama bin Laden. And this was when we were still hunting for him. And we set up a meeting with this Jordanian doctor in an air base in Coast, Afghanistan. We thought this was our way to get to bin Laden, right? We got him. This is somebody who was volunteering information. He knew where he was. And we said, let's meet with him. Let's get high-level leadership, including this woman, Jennifer Matthews, who had been leading the fight to find bin Laden for years at that point, actually going even pre-9/11, looking for bin Laden before 9/11. And we're so excited that we finally had a chance to get to bin Laden that we ignored a lot of security restrictions. We ignored vetting our assets. And the Jordanian doctor drove into the airbase with a car full of explosives and blew himself and a dozen other people up. And it was the largest loss of life of CIA assets since Vietnam. Even more than Beirut in 1983. And this is more likely what a Mossad operation would face if they fall for a dangle or if they fall for bad asset validation versus, I'm not trying to downplay the dangers that CIA personnel deal with in Russia and other places, but to give Mossad and Shin Bet the credit where credit's due, it's an entirely different operating environment. Now, CIA knows this, unfortunately, very well now. Since 9/11, we're operating in many of the same environments as Mossad and Shin Bet are. But back in the heyday of the Cold War, our focus was Moscow and Beijing and places like Belgrade and others that had that more gentlemanly agreement.
I think often there's an attempt by people to compare to who's the best intelligence service and so forth. And I think that's difficult to do if you take an agency like Mossad, which essentially has had for many years a pretty narrow focus, and that's on its neighbors. What's happening in the neighborhood, which was essentially the Middle East. Obviously, they've had to expand that to a degree, whereas the burden on the United States intelligence community, that is the agency and others, is to cover the world and space and everything else. So there's a whole difference in focus. One thing I would like to stress, if any of you are interested enough to take a look at Baskin's book, is the extraordinary amount of what I call tradecraft that the Mossad used to go after Eichmann. I mean, the burden initially was, is this really Eichmann? And they used cameras concealed in briefcases to take pictures of Clement, that was his cover name, and his son, and wife and of the house. Of course, they didn't have overhead satellites or a lot of things they didn't have, but they worked with what they had. They had some local assets, people who were friendly to the Mossad and would carry out tasks. But their use of actual operational tradecraft was superb, right down to trying to organize an operation to get Eichmann out of the safe house where he was being held. Some of the folks in the operation couldn't bear to be with him, and to the airport in a state of more or less medically induced drowsiness, and on board the plane. This was sort of a memorial flight. Vince and I were talking about this. I think it was the first direct flight, the first flight from Israel to Buenos Aires, I think. But anyway, just reading it for the tradecraft alone. If you remember, how many have seen Argo? That's again an example of getting someone out of the country secretly. But you remember there was that Tony Mendez, who's our colleague on the board, went in there with another person. They were both master forgers. They were able to make passports or alter passports or make documents on the spot. An extraordinary talent. Tony, before he came in the agency, was an artist. He answered an ad saying a government agency was looking for artists, so he signed up. He had no idea he would become a master forger. But that same thing held for the Mossad. They recruited someone who was able to do this sort of work, and he did it before he was recruited and after the operation and other operations, of which he was very proud. He went back to being an artist. I think one of his journals is on display right here in the museum in the exhibit that was it Malik? Was that his name?
Right.
Peter Malik, yeah. And just a beautiful journal.
Of course, the 6 Americans leaving Iran actually wanted to leave Iran.
Yes, that's
Eichmann
true. There's a
so
difference.
much
Yeah.
wanted to leave. So let's open it up to questions. There's a microphone coming around right to your
Yeah.
left, sir. And so you get to choose who answers the question. You're the king of the microphone. So whoever you give it to. All right. So.
Okay, great.
When I walked in the Locke's place, I saw you two guys with a third guy sitting, and I said, they're spies. So I sat at the table next to you and listened to what you were talking about, and then you were talking in code. I could tell because you were talking about some kind of real estate development.
Yeah.
Anyway, having said that, my question...
It sounds like your eyesight and hearing are both very good. Yeah.
Well, you, sir, were clearly a spy. I could tell that. My question is a sad one, and that is when POTUS was bashing the CIA, how do thousands of you take it? I mean, and not POTUS, you know what that is?
Yes.
Apparently one of you does not know who POTUS is.
I know who POTUS is.
Yeah.
But what is the question?
The question is...
What was the reaction to the attack, quote unquote, the calling CIA Nazis and
You
not
got it,
listening
that's
to the
it.
17 different intelligence agencies when they came back with? Yeah.
The Americans who serve in the military and who serve certainly in the federal government are patriotic citizens. They are working for America. They take an oath to the Constitution. They have a job to do. It's our job to do what we do. Is it demoralizing to have a president who offends your workforce, who takes what you do lightly? Yes, it is demoralizing, but we still do what we do. I will tell you that as I talk with my colleagues, we are so grateful that the current POTUS is surrounded by the likes of H.R. McMaster, General Mattis, and John Kelly. They are keeping the so-called adult daycare center in good order. But it's sad that we have come to that, and that I should be here saying that, but I'm afraid that's where we are right now. We were just chatting earlier, I think it was Elise asked me about our democracy, and I was reminded of Franklin's phrase, what are you? A republic if you can keep it. That means if you can keep it. There's no guarantee we'll go on forever as the republic that we are.
I thought you were going to start off being aggressively diplomatic because you're basically saying, well, we're all professional. It pissed a lot of people off.
Yeah. There are resignations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that you're starting to see, there's an old kind of stereotype, and it's a stereotype because there's truth behind it, but that people who are in operations, like Peter was, tended to be more to the right of the political spectrum, tend to be more Republican. They're the ones, the door kickers, the ones going overseas, spreading American democracy. In the analyst side of the shop, which is the other big part of CIA, they're the eggheads, they're the intellectuals. They're the ones who tended to be more liberal, more to the left. And that was, the 70s, it was like as polarized and segregated to the point where they were in different areas of the building. And they had different cafeterias, and they only met in the middle when they had to. Right, that's how polarized it was at certain points at CIA. You're not seeing it that polarized anymore. There are people who are ex-CIA now running for Congress as Democrats. That doesn't happen all that often. What I think it's done is it's superseded party. And I think there's not a Democrat-Republican divide among the foreign policy community anymore. I'm including all the NatSec, right? The military, I'm including the other agencies. I think there is oh my God, let's make sure we survive the next 6, hopefully less than 6 years.
It's a difficult period. I'm a registered Democrat, okay? Registered independent, but I've usually voted straight Democrat statewide elections. I've broken that for a couple of Republican presidential candidates. Who's calling that? You're calling that? Here we go.
Yeah, wherever you go, we'll answer.
Yeah.
Put the onus on you.
It's well known that usually when some of your colleagues, former or contemporary, going to write a book, an article, they need to receive permission from organization. So how you would explain that right now, all over the Jewish press, including Alan Dershkovich wrote about Philip Goraldin and Valerie Plame, you know the name, right? Valerie Plame.
Valerie Plame.
Yes.
Valerie Plame.
And another one, he also was a resident, worked for many years for CIA, Philip Goraldin, who ran totally anti-Semitic site and blamed Jews for everything in the universe.
Yeah.
But we know...
All cliché of this.
Yeah, we know, we know Valerie Plame. She's come to the Art Museum and spoken there many times. The only one who went to jail was Libby, as you remember, for perjury. The one who identified her as an agency person, as I remember, was the Deputy Secretary of State. Do you remember who that was? Vince?
Yeah, but
And it was an
blanking on it
accident,
now.
in his case. But the investigation continued to find out whether someone had deliberately identified her as an agency employee. Yes, as an intelligence officer. Now, she was an intelligence officer. She was in the Directorate of Operations, just like myself. So her function was collecting intelligence. And, when she was identified, although she had functioned in other names as well, that made her career very difficult.
Were you also,
Is there a more precise? I didn't hear.
were you also asking about
Yeah.
her recent tweets? Okay, so there's one of two things going on here. One is that she's anti-Semitic, which is possible, but I'd like to see more direct evidence. The other one that I think is more likely is that she's stupid. And I mean that in the sense that it's social media where you.
I quote this from Jewish press,
No, I've seen what she wrote. Yeah, right. Who's you can't call him anti-Semitic, but you can call him stupid too. But it was really unfortunate and really stupid for her to do what she did. Now, you want to go beyond, that's fine. But you asked the question in the beginning about getting things approved by the agency. That's true. That's called a publication review board. And that's if you're writing anything that is dealing with your specific field. Like you're writing anything that is CIA related, or a book, a memoir about your life, or a novel that's spy related, the Publication Review Board will look at it to make sure you're not giving away any classified information. Content beyond that doesn't matter. So if you want to write your own version of Mein Kampf, and as long as you're not giving away classified information, the CIA is not going to get in your way. And that, maybe they should to save your professional career, but they're not going to stop you from doing stupid stuff. They're going to stop you from releasing information that shouldn't be released to the American public. So a lot of times people will write books. One of our board members is Michael Hayden. You may have heard of him. He's former director of CIA and NSA. He wrote a book, came out a year and a half ago, called Playing to the Edge. Really good if you haven't read it. That man understands the politics of espionage and intelligence more than anybody on earth. That book should have came out about a year and a half earlier. But the PRB of both NSA and CIA said, you got to cut this, you got to change this, you got to do this, you got to do all this. And so we had to go through this back and forth saying, I don't want to cut that. Why are you making me cut that? And so that's true for anything that you publish. But again, they're just making sure that you don't release secrets. You can be as dumb as you want to otherwise.
Yeah, and typically that people, there are still First Amendment rights.
Yeah.
If somebody chooses to say dumb things, and I look at Twitter as a form of speaking, and she's not the only one to use Twitter, as you know, then they're going to do that. And it's unlikely the Publications Review Board would come after them.
Yeah,
I mean, we have no, once people leave the agency, it's like any organization they've left. Unless, as Vince mentions, they're actually writing about their experiences or about intelligence.
I mean, for any government personnel, there's a fine line between what they're willing to censor and what they're not. I mean, there's an embarrassment to the agency level, and that's true for like the FBI or Department of Commerce or anything else. But of course, the First Amendment comes into play. So there's a lot of wiggle room, a lot of leash that are given before you crack down and say, don't do that. In her case, even if she was, CIA, she wouldn't be tweeting anyway, but if she was working for another government agency, she may have gotten hey, that was really, really dumb, what you're doing. But the likelihood is you're still gonna allow somebody to speak their mind unless it directly interferes with their job. Wherever she goes, we'll answer.
We're, yeah.
How does the CIA decide whether to do joint work with some other intelligence agency from other countries?
How does the CIA decide?
To do joint operations or joint operations work with other countries?
Operations have a way of evolving. The idea for doing something may be originated anywhere. It might come out of the State Department, out of the Army, out of the Marine Corps, and it makes its way to the National Security Council, let's say. The president may think of an idea, let's do such and such, but then it has to be vetted. I'm reading Mike Morell's book on the War of Our Times, and he makes the point that the president directed that the CIA would be overall in charge of the operation to capture Osama bin Laden. But it was actually JSOC, a Joint Special Operations Group, that carried the operation out, actually went into the house in Abbottabad and struck. So that was a joint operation, and CIA was overall in charge.
Yeah, other countries. I'll go to the international side. So the interesting little tidbit is when the Navy SEALs went into Pakistan, they were no longer Navy SEALs. They were actually seconded to CIA. So the Navy SEALs didn't kill bin Laden, the CIA did, technically. When the Navy SEALs got back on the helicopters and flew back out of Pakistan, they were Navy SEALs again. The idea was we weren't going to send military forces into Pakistan, because that's, starting wars and stuff.
It's called hiding behind your finger.
Yes.
Sort of, yeah.
Yes. So there are different levels to our relationships with other countries. Have you heard of the term Five Eyes before? So there's a hierarchy in how we deal with other countries on an intelligence level. There are 5 countries, we call them the Five Eyes, and that's because of eyes only, that designation you might have seen in the movies. These are the 5 English-speaking countries: the Americans, the Canadians, the British, the New Zealanders, and the Australians. That group shares everything including operational commands, including covert action. All information is shared between those 5 countries with really no limitations whatsoever. And people say, do you tell all the things you know to the other Five Eyes country? Like, no, you tell all the things you know to a lot of countries. What you tell the Five Eyes countries is what you don't know. And that's the most secret of secrets, is our gaps in intelligence. And that's what we share with these other countries. Then there's another level of kind of this hierarchy that includes NATO nations, nations that we're directly involved with in the Pacific, like Japan, that are part of this second tier, where it's not all that difficult for us to do joint operations, to do joint intelligence analysis. We have what are called fusion centers. You might have heard of a fusion center before. Fusion center internally is where you're bringing together, it's post 9/11, and it's a response to 9/11. If you remember, 9/11 was blamed, rightly so, on the fact that these agencies weren't talking to each other. The FBI knew that there were people in Florida and Arizona learning how to fly planes but not caring about how to land the planes. The CIA knew that bin Laden and al-Qaeda was determined to attack in the United States. The FBI and CIA didn't talk to each other. I don't know if it would have stopped 9/11, but it would have made a difference. So fusion centers were designed to bring together people from different government agencies. So you'll have members from CIA, operations people, analysts, FBI, special operations people. You'll have people from National Reconnaissance Office, from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, from Army Intelligence, from the DEA, right? I mean, and then also from foreign governments. So you may have Canadians in there, or British people, or if it's, for instance, the Counterterrorism Fusion Center, because their fusion centers are geographically specific, but also thematically specific. There's a counterintelligence, a counterterror, counterproliferation. So the CT Fusion Center may have representatives from Jordanian intelligence. They're one of our top allies in the Middle East. Certainly they're our top Arab ally in the Middle East. You may have Israeli intelligence people in a fusion center. And that's where you have this level of cooperation that doesn't exist, let's say, with the Russians. It's unlikely you're going to let a Russian into one of our fusion centers unless there's an extreme circumstance. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that came out of the 9/11 Commission after 9/11 here in the city was that there was a feeling that the intelligence community elements, CIA, DIA, and so forth, were too compartmented. They were smokestacks, but they were next to each other and not sharing enough. And so up until that time, 9/11, the sort of mantra for intelligence agency was need to know. Does someone need to know something before you passed it to them? After that, the mantra became need to share, need to push out information, need to let other people know what they're doing. And that's part of what led to the Snowden phenomenon, where you had so much information available to more people than it might have been in the past. Up until then, I mean, things were very, I ran operations my own deputy didn't know about in CIA. There was nothing wrong about that. It wasn't illegal, but it was because we kept things so highly compartmented. And after that, there was more pressure on us to share as much as possible. There's a great strength in sharing things. We're all finding that out. The more information that's shared, the more people that know it's a help. Except in the world of intelligence, it's tremendous for analysis. It can be harmful to operations, and where is the line? Where do you draw the line between those? It's very difficult.
And all of that was legislated in 2004 with the IRTPA, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. Essentially, this is what created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which is now the kind of the clearinghouse. It created the capital I, capital C intelligence community, those 17 different agencies that became famous during the last election, which include everything from Coast Guard intelligence all the way up through CIA, where you do have the opportunity for better sharing, but as Peter, it's a double-edged sword, because someone like Edward Snowden, who was a low-level IT tech attached to NSA through working for Booz Allen as a contractor, had access to documents he never would have if it was as compartmentalized as it used to be. So we're constantly trying to find a happy medium. We're constantly trying to find the place where you can balance liberty and secrecy and security and transparency all at the same time. Clearly, we have screwed up several times in the past. 9/11 is a great example of us getting too complacent and thinking that the Cold War had ended and our problems were over. And then the Patriot Act was a huge swing in the opposite direction, where we freaked out and went bonkers the wrong direction. And now we're trying to work our way back. But you had in the 1990s Daniel Patrick Moynihan saying, do we really need a CIA? Right? The Cold War is over. We don't really need a CIA anymore. And then...
You're reminding me
Yeah.
about that time when Moynihan was, do we really need the CIA? And that really was a question he raised in Congress. And I remember sitting at the cafeteria in that building that you've all seen in the movies where they come sweeping in, the main building in Langley. And I remember saying, people were wondering, gee, they're questioning the CIA. I mean, what do you think's going to happen? And we all looked outside and we noticed that the grass wasn't being mowed. We thought, that's it. Intelligence officers were the ones who smell the flowers and ask who died. So, that was a big indicator. The grass wasn't being mowed. This is it. They don't need the CIA.
Well, and then the same questions after the Snowden revelations were, should we shut down the NSA? Like, is it more trouble than it's worth? So there's this constant reimagining and rebirth of these agencies where we're trying to find the happy medium between being overbearing and, violating American individual and constitutional rights and keeping the country safe. And one of our board members, or now board member emeritus, is a woman named Stella Remington. And Stella was the first female head of any major Western intelligence agency. She was the director of MI5, which is British domestic intelligence, counterintelligence. She's actually the model for Judi Dench's M in Bond, too. Like, they look the same, they act the same. Like, that's who Judi Dench cut her hair to look like, is Stella. And she has a very good way of putting this, where it's all about risk. It's how much risk are you willing to accept? If you're willing to accept no risk, meaning you're never going to have another 9/11 type event, you're never going to have another terrorist attack, then you're in East Germany in the 1960s. Then you're living with the Stasi, or you're living in Havana today. If you're willing to have a lot of risks, meaning a lot of freedom, then you're going to have to take one on the chin every once in a while, because that's where you're deciding. Now, can you find that happy medium is what the constant struggle is to try to do. And that's where you can argue against the consolidation of the intelligence community, but one of the things it's done is kind of force this question to the forefront, is saying, how do we create a system where Congress is involved, God forbid, but Congress, they sometimes have good ideas, where Congress is involved, where courts like FISA, right, the courts that determine whether or not you can listen in to foreign conversations, and then the agencies themselves, the Justice Department, all these things come together and figure out what makes the most sense.
Yeah, one of the things I would say is we make fun of Congress, which is not hard to do, but the intelligence, in other words, your oversight is both in the elections process, and that is the things the president has done that you feel were right or wrong, but also through Congress. And the oversight of the intelligence community is through the intelligence oversight committees. And since the 1976 Church Committee hearings and the formation of permanent oversight committees, you, the public, oversee the intelligence communities through those oversight committees. And I will tell you that my term in dealing with the senators and with the senators' staff was I was deeply impressed. I knew how some other governments worked, but I was very impressed at the level of knowledge and the level of caring about what we were doing in the intelligence community. There were some very fine senators when I was down there. Senator Jackson, if you remember, people of Lugar and so forth. These people cared about the country. They'd been selected by their leadership to be on the oversight committee. And so I felt at that time that the process was working. And so now you've got the intelligence committees now looking into this Russian hacking. I saw something the other night on a crawl on one of the news shows that Americans were getting tired of the Russian investigation. This is no small thing. Having been in covert action myself, you know, it's not as if one single tweet or one single insertion in a news show turned the election. It's the whole weight of all the things that are done, all the things that contribute to the outcome of election. We may never know the extent of influence that the Russian hacking had, but the more we learn, the more influence it seems to have had. This is a very worrisome thing.
It's possible it's the most successful covert action in world history.
You've got a hand way in the back. Who's doing hands? Yeah.
Time for
Way in the
one
back.
more
Oh, she's got two
question.
hands up. Yeah, all the way in the back there.
Sorry, we're long-winded, and I
Yeah,
apologize we
I
didn't
know,
get to
yeah.
everybody's questions.
Jump in, cut in on us.
Hi, I'm just curious. Going back to the capture of Eichmann, so much technology has changed in the world since then. If you were to run this operation now, how would you run it, and how quickly do you think he would have been captured?
Well, I think we can both comment on that, but one of the huge advantages of operations today is the use of overhead photography. And we would have, as you remember, in the bin Laden operation, there was great difficulty in ascertaining whether he was in that house in Abbottabad. At one point, they asked experts to estimate. They saw this one figure who looked tall, and everybody said, well, he's between 5'7" and 5'11". That didn't help at all. But our overhead photography has gotten so good that I think if you had had a state effort, well, it was a state effort, it was Israel, but if you had the capability of overhead photography, that would have been an enormous asset in trying to determine the movements in and around that house and trying to determine where he went to work and so forth. There are other aspects.
Well, you would have looked at things like facial recognition, which is lots of places. With today's technology, think of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is the most surveilled city in the world. It used to be London, now it's Washington, D.C. There are more cameras in D.C. than anywhere else. Everything from ATMs to bubble cameras on all the government buildings. It would be very difficult for someone to walk around a major metropolitan city and not get picked up on film. Now, my argument is the way we would deal with it today is wait for his family to go out and put a hellfire through his window from a drone. There's a reason we didn't capture Osama bin Laden. The joke we talked about before is, how the hell would you get him on a plane today with the kind of problems with everything from TSA to security to everything else? I mean, this guy's stumbling and bumbling his way onto a plane. They're like, oh, don't worry about him. He's with us. Well, obviously, you couldn't do that today. But if you did want to get him back to trial, you have probably a much more difficult time than you would otherwise, because not only would Eichmann be more susceptible to the surveillance, but the Mossad team would have a much more difficult time moving freely through any kind of modern city or modern area. Not only that, remember, they were able to get into Argentina using kind of off-their-cuff, make up a fake travel agency in Europe and then fly from all over the place. But that kind of stuff doesn't happen today. It's much more difficult to insert people into any kind of metropolitan area today. I mean, this isn't back of the woods somewhere in Argentina. We're talking about Buenos Aires here, right? This is a major city. The difficulty in getting a large team like that in to do any kind of covert action would be insanely difficult. That's why I think you would have looked at everything and said, you know what, we'll send in a team to get the remains and then do DNA testing and show the world that it was Eichmann. And that's kind of what the Mossad started doing going into the 1970s. If you look at Operation Wrath of God, which is the response to the Munich Olympics massacre, they didn't run around capturing the Black September people. They went and made a statement by spreading little pieces of the Black September people all over European streets. I'm sorry, that was the point, right? That Golda Meir was like, make them pay and make them know that they don't kill Jewish people. I think that would have been the response. I mean, that would have been the American response to that.
The other thing I would add to what we're talking about here is The difficulty now of moving around people like myself undercover with all of the biometric measures that are being adapted. Now, you know, it's like military technology. You develop this, I develop this, and so forth. There are now means being developed to elude biometric measures. Difficult, but it can be done. Let me just go back to something I talked about earlier, which was sort of sleeper agents. Keep in mind that part of what the Mossad was up against, Mossad was a young organization. It had limited experience. It had a lot of experience with fighting the British, fighting the Palestinians, and so forth, but limited experience on this kind of operation. And they were working in a country which was by and large friendly to the Germans. There were German, quote, sleeper type agents all over the place.
That was very, not by and large.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
so-
Argentina.
and so they were up
There's a
against-
reason there's a lot of little Argentinian kids named Adolfo running
they
around.
knew
I
if
mean,
they
that-
made a slip, then that would get back to the Germans. And they were very concerned that if Eichmann heard anything about the hunt for Eichmann being you know, moved up the ladder, he would run. He would be spooked, and he was very capable of that. And that was their great concern, not to spook Eichmann.
Well, like Mengele, right?
Yeah,
Mengele,
yeah.
they
They
had a
thought
chance to
they
get
thought
him.
they had a lead on Mengele, Dr. Mengele also, and they did, but he was spooked, and he did get out ahead of them. So that's another thing. I mean, I brought people out of the country where I was, and I was bringing people out in other names. We were quite capable of doing that without being concerned about today's measures on most airport security. They had to work against in a society that was generally somewhat hostile to what they were trying to do.
That's why a $50,000 Hellfire missile, don't go home without it. I mean, no one's lives were put on the line. You know, I don't think the reliance on drones today is particularly healthy. I think it was something that we did at the very specific time period. But there are times when there's a reason you send in a drone. There's no pilot. There's no, you can limit collateral damage to a degree, and you're not putting yourself in any kind of diplomatic situation of getting your guys caught. All right? That's right. Look, this operation worked really, really well. And in hindsight, we're like, what a great operation. What an amazing but imagine if it hadn't, right? Imagine if they'd been caught, right? Israel at this time didn't have a lot of friends in the world. And they would have had a whole lot less. I mean, you just by pulling them out and getting to the UN, Argentina raised a stink before the UN, and there were a lot of people who were on the side of Argentina against the Israelis in this. Not enough, but imagine if this Mossad team had been caught in place in Argentina, that could have been incredibly problematic.
Yeah. The other thing, too, you asked me about, excuse me, current technology. As you know, you can have drones the size of a locust. They could have sent a drone into that house, unnoticed, but capable of looking and recording. And that would simply be another listening device. There were just so many different ways that they could have tried to further identify him and make sure they had the right person. The technology has just leaped ahead. For an operation like that, even the operation at the airport, they would have still been able to lay it on, but it would have required liaison, and that would have been difficult for us in Argentina at that time.
All right, so let me finish. One last thing. All right, sorry. The CIA actually had a container they used to smuggle people out. Essentially, they put them in a box and then shipped them out with air holes. It's like exactly what you'd think of, right? Like an animal in a box. And they were able to stamp diplomatic courier material on it, and it couldn't be searched, and you'd ship it out with the rest of the diplomatic mail, and it would be either someone who wanted to get out or somebody who didn't want to get out, and we were grabbing them from somewhere. And that's 1970s era technology. So we don't know what we have today, and if I did know what we have today, I couldn't tell you what we have today. But we're far more advanced than that now, and all the smuggling people off the black sites and rendition and everything else demonstrates that we have the capability of getting somebody from point A to point B without anyone knowing. And certainly the Israelis today have that technology if they haven't been the ones that develop it in the first place.
You know, if we're to believe Elon Musk, all you have to do is put someone in a metal tube and fire them out of the country.
Hyperloop them. We can
Perfectly
hyperloop
free,
them.
yeah.
All right. Are you waving us off, or are we?
How are we doing?
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you to our speakers and thank you to everyone who came out.
Okay.